And good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And tonight it's my pleasure to welcome back to the show Bill Taylor. Bill Taylor of D-State Analytics. And Bill has been very busy on Twitter lately, as often I see. And anyway, we check in with one another at least once a month, and it's a pleasure to have you back. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Well, listen, I stole for the little thumbnail for tonight's show from your Twitter uh, banner, where you quote J. Edgar Hoover in saying something that I don't think very many people are aware that he said it, but it basically is the well. Let me get it up here, and I'll just read it. It's. Where are you at? There you are. Okay, this is J. Edgar Hoover, August 1956. The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists, unquote. And I guess I wanted to start with that and say, well, obviously this means a lot to you, putting it in a prominent place there. Means a lot to me because, my dad was working for J. Edgar Hoover at that very time. And so it's likely that, they knew stuff that we don't know that they knew. And the, the, the thing is, um, I wonder if we've ever come face to face with this conspiracy, because it seems to me that we keep kicking the can down the road, and it's the same problem that he was reciting to us back in 1956. Um, your thoughts? Did that conspiracy exist, and does it still exist, and is it even more monstrous than it was then?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you just read it like that, and then you said August 1956. So I was scrolling towards this specific post that I wrote about it back in March of 2021, and I noticed a lot of my posts begin in the 1950s, around that era, around 1956, 57, all the way through 1960, and I think it was never intentional. I don't think it's sort of these because the subjects I write about are on a broad array of sort of deep state topics that don't appear to be necessarily related, but they all kind of coalesce around that 1955 to 1960 period, and it was just almost like an epiphany when you said that. Um, yeah, I think that the conspiracy it's bigger than it was in the 1950s when he said that in 1956. I But conversely, I don't think it's as big as the conspirators ever sort of portrayed it as, in that still running into the same people every time. It's just, or the same families in the same corporations and societies. So it is a big conspiracy. It's decades lasting. It may seem overwhelming and hard to swallow, but really, I think the conspirators at the top who know what the entire picture is probably relatively limited. You know, a couple thousand people, maybe even just a couple hundred people. But let's say it's in the low thousands. And that period was very interesting. And actually, I forget the context at which with Hoover brought that up, but this was also the era where he was denying that there was such a thing as the mafia, as the Italian mafia or La Cosa Nostra. Um, and it might
I've heard people put a finer point on that to say that no, he wasn't denying that there was a mafia, but he was denying that it was a national syndicate mafia, and there's where I think the corruption starts to be apparent, because he knew that there was a national syndicate mafia. He must have.
Oh, definitely. And I'd have to go back and review what I had originally wrote, but you could probably argue um, that there was no national Italian mafia, national syndicated Italian mafia. But it would be hard to argue that, and maybe that's what they asked him: is La Cosa Nostra a nationwide phenomenon, criminal phenomenon? And he could probably honestly say no, they're not connected. The families are not connected entirely under some sort of national umbrella. But what I'm finding out, I think that the national syndicate is probably running a lot of these families, these Italian families. So there is an overarching umbrella. They're just not necessarily led by the Italian mobsters that we're all familiar with from real life and from fiction.
Well, there was the Appalachian Conference that purportedly was to put together a syndicate, and that, of course, was apparently busted. Somebody leaked about it, but right now we have a huge amount of organized crime. It's not necessarily from Italian origins at all, or Sicilian origins at all, but definitely a factor all throughout our government, and impacting in every area of life. So yeah, and it to me it's almost like the real devil is simply money. The real evil behind everything is just that money drives people to do horrible things at some point. And the enforcement of debts becomes violence at a certain point, and that money is the root of all evil seems to satisfy me as to who's really behind all this. It could just be greed. But maybe we can put a better description on it than that.
Well, yeah, no, it's definitely greed, but it just kind of metastasizes like a childhood lie. You tell a parent that it wasn't me, and then who was it? Oh, it was my brother. It wasn't him either. Then you roped your brother into the lie. Now
we're starting to get into Genesis and Exodus here.
Right. I mean, you say the ball starts rolling. You have to keep the cover up going. There can never be an honest accounting of where the money is coming from. Because they're still tapping the same sources of illicit wealth. It's these people are not inventing anything novel. They're not entrepreneurs. They're grifters, and that's what it almost looks like. They're not even that smart. They just sort of keep their grifting franchise going, and they'll do anything to keep it going, including bribing judges or infiltrating intelligence organizations or the federal government or state governments. And that's why I don't think it's that large, because if it was that large, then it would have entirely taken up the entire country's resources.
But well, I have to disagree with you, because I think that maybe the organized crime part of it is not that large, but the conspiracy itself, I think what Hoover was talking about is also the banking conspiracy, the Wall Street conspiracy, and what we speak of as the banksters. Don't you include that?
But there's a legitimate business going on in the banks. I mean, it's the banksters.
Maybe a little bit.
well, there is. I mean, they're providing capital to companies that need capital. I think back to Coca-Cola did SunTrust Bank did their IPO, I think in 1906 or something like that. They provided the capital to get off the ground. I mean, there's a legitimate there's legitimate uses for this capital. I think
Yeah, getting everybody
solid,
addicted to cocaine.
I think there's solid pockets of it though that are just entirely illicit. I mean, I went through 20 years of Wall Street career. I never ran into any dirty money, and actually, we're always on the look. The regulators were so up everybody's butt that we're always on the lookout for dirty money.
Well, what
Now,
about HSBC and BCCI and all of these drug laundering banks, the ones that we've discussed in the uh, investigation of Nugan Hand Bank and Castle Bank and Trust Company, and all of these flimsy, uh, but somehow well
FTX.
financed CIA assets. But it does involve the drug trade in a big way with HSBC, which was legitimate drug laundering back before it was illegal. And
Right. It's pervasive. I think that there is a real economy. Um, what Hoover I think was referring to is sort of the players beyond, like who is really manipulating everybody else. Um, and I think in the post that I wrote, it's what is it called? It's called. Well, I just used the title, but I use that quote as the title: "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face." You have this red scare. What I go into a lot is you have this red scare at the time, and everybody's sort of looking at the communists as the head of this conspiracy.
gotcha.
And what I think that Hoover might have realized or been referring to is that there's something bigger. There's a bigger group of conspirators. There's a cabal manipulating that, manipulating the left wing movement and both the right wing movement, both globally and domestically. So you have the Red Scares, but the Red Scare sort of provides a cover. It's a look over here. These communists are going to take over, while these almost wise guys are raiding the are robbing the bank while everybody's looking for the scary communists. And he also, excuse me.
I just go saying, okay, so Ocean's 11 is going on while everybody's
Well,
looking for reds.
right. Yeah, and think about it. That was, I mean, the Red Scare has always been like really the top. As far as anybody could see was that the communists or the Russians were going to somehow take over at some point. There was never anything above that. I would say the same thing with the mafia, with the Italian mafia. In the movies, you're sort of conditioned to believe that the Godfather is the top guy. There's nobody above him. Though he doesn't have to answer to anybody. Whether it's Goodfellas or Donnie Brasco or the first two Godfathers. You get the idea that they're unanswerable to anybody. But I think these communist groups, these Italian mafia groups, are answering to the banksters. And you could even argue a lot of these right-wing groups were answering to the banksters. Whether they all knew that they were answering to the same people, probably not. But they're all being manipulated to play a part. And only a few people knew that they were being manipulated.
Yes, and that that's the real conspiracy, and I think I conflate it with what Woodrow Wilson said famously about how there is some secret force that even powerful businessmen will not speak of above their breath, and that force frightened Woodrow Wilson. I think that idea of keeping the presidents in thrall or in fright, so that whatever goes on behind the scenes, they'll tend to not want to know about. and look the other way, as many of them did, uh, that enables them to keep doing their bankster or mafioso or whatever you want to call it. It's in essence, it's stealing from the public till. It's taking away from those of us that are honest the rights that we would otherwise have to enjoy that public money. Build a school, build a park, but instead of whatever you're doing with it, sending it overseas to do some secret military mission to promote the corporate interests of some highly connected corporation. And anyway, well, let's change the subject. What have you been working on? What would you say is your big number one subject that you've dug into lately?
It's I've started a couple new essays. I think but I've had some difficulty finishing them because I've hit some roadblocks. Um, Sort of the internet makes things harder and harder to find. It seems on a monthly basis. But I'll mention one thing it's the one road that I've sort of looked down and I might revisit soon. Um, it's the right wing side of this sort of the dialectic in the creation of some of these right wing groups. There's certainly a number of left wing groups that you could say are Rockefeller funded, but the right wing groups are also interesting. And on the right, you have the Minute Women of the USA, which started in the early 1950s to combat communism. The most interesting, the most I've written about is uh, the American Nazi Party, started by George Lincoln Rockwell in 1957. That I'm convinced is a wholly owned school play of the Rockefeller bunch. Another one that has popped up, and I made it popped up in an interesting place, and it's the Minutemen of the USA, not the Minute Women of the USA. Actually, it's the Minutemen of America. The Minute Women and the Minute Men, they were formed about 10 years apart, and so far I haven't seen any connection between the two. The Minute Women were actually more of a mom's group looking for what's that curriculum that they're talking about now? Uh, the woke curriculum that everybody's up in arms about now. Well, they were looking for it in the 1950s.
What critical race theory?
Critical race theory type stuff. So the Minute Women of the USA was looking for critical race theory. It was more communist race, communist teachings theory in the curriculum back in the early 1950s. So they were actually pretty mainstream in some cities. But the Minutemen turned out to be, it's gone down a couple different rabbit holes. First of all, it was a branch, it was broken off from the John Birch Society, which is interesting in itself because John Birch Society got pilloried with a lot of accusations of anti-Semitism and extremism after some of these sort of outsiders joined the group. And it's almost like that the John Birch Society was at least partially infiltrated to make the entire John Birch Society look more extremist than they really were, and more anti-Semitic than they ever were. But so one of
that's a really important point because I noticed that whenever there's somebody on the right that is making waves, it's causing trouble, that may be pushing them to make a revelation of some kind, that they'll end up using the anti-Semitic, label. They'll just label them that, and they'll repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and it seems to be the primary way of discrediting somebody on the right, that they just don't want to hear his voice.
No, and I would say, it's interesting because you do see these organic groups that I would call, from what I've read and what I've been able to see, the John Birch Society was an organically created right of center, political action group, if you will, uh, more classic conservatism. Um, but then it became tainted with this anti-Semitism at a couple of years down the road. Once their membership had grown pretty substantially, you actually see it on the left as well, where you have plenty of organic, well-meaning civil rights groups forming during the 1950s, but then sort of becoming tainted with charges of communism or having communist leanings, to maybe that make them less sympathetic to your average middle class person in the 1950s. And I would say Nation of Islam is another one of those maybe civil rights groups which almost went to the extreme to really turn people away. And it was, then you could take the whole movement with the Nation of Islam, the whole civil rights movement with, well, look, the Nation of Islam is calling for Jews to be eradicated or something extreme like that.
Yeah.
And you have it on both sides of the spectrum. But the Minutemen, a couple of things interesting about the Minutemen, which was formed about 59 as an offshoot of the John Birch Society. The person who founded it was named John Depew. I think I said that correctly. I think it was John. Last name was Depew. He was a vet, owned a company that made antibiotics and medicines for animals. He's a veterinary medical laboratory, and in his sort of, by the early 60s, he's proposing all kinds of crazy genocidal type ways to eradicate not just animals but people. Very similar to what what we're seeing now in the in the space of creating pandemics and unleashing viruses like anthrax or Ebola. But he was very much at the center of that. And it was just kind of scary. You think that maybe some of this thinking goes back that long, that far. And then there's one other connection, which I don't know if it's a connection yet, but it's just curious. In the JFK files, there's a reference to a gentleman whose name is Adams. I'm not John Adams. I'm going to say Frank Adams. Frank Adams was a 92-year-old veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and he was pulled over by the Miami police in 1964, and he was receiving and sending mail with the name Minutemen on them. Now there's a Minutemen. There was another group called the Minutemen, which has been around since the 1920s and considered themselves sort of like the Minutemen of the Daughters of the Revolution type of society, patriotic society. And this gentleman named Adams, who was related to Sam Adams and John Quincy Adams and the whole Adams clan, was very patriotic. But he was receiving and sending literature out, and the FBI seemed a little confused, and I'm still a little bit confused as to what he was actually doing, and if maybe the name wasn't co-opted along the way somehow. But the most fascinating thing that I found about Mr. Adams, the Spanish Civil War vet, is he actually ran a company that published a textile magazine, textile trade magazine, which was probably from the mid 1920s to the mid 1950s. But I keep running into the textile connections, and I'm viewing this fellow a little suspiciously just because of that connection. It looks like they had this inway into this textile cartel, if you will. And I'm wondering if he is somehow connected, helped establish this Minutemen society, the more violent one that came along later, under the earlier name of this sort of more patriotic society. It's a long haul, but there's some real curiosities in this Spanish Civil War veterans' comings and goings during the late 1950s and 60s. when he was still 90 years old.
I'm still not seeing what is interesting about him.
He's connected to this textile industry, upper management or C-suite families. If you think the textile industries are a lot of these Southern families, that you also have the Amories were textile families. Just about anybody who had essentially a Rothschild, ultimately a Rothschild connection,
Yeah.
through the textile network.
Well, that's what I wanted to dig into, because it seems to me that a lot of the early work that I did led me into textile industries, and this man named Mallinckrodt ends up in I think St. Louis running Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals. That now has the contract to import cocaine for medical purposes, and I think also has a big contract with Medicare or Medicaid or something. But all this starts with him being in the textile business in France, I believe, or perhaps Switzerland, and marrying into royalty, and the connection also to the Moses Cone estate up in North Carolina, where I was over my birthday weekend in October. That place is huge, and that he's like the guy that did the denim. So that's textiles for you. These textile magnates also seem to be very well connected with the Rothschild financing network generally. And I think I talked with David Underdown about Moses Cone, and it looks like his family would pretty easily, if we did the work, be connected to the Rothschilds. All of this is obscure to the American people. So that's why I think, when we run into something like that, where does it lead, though? If this man was connected with these textiles, does that have anything to do with the assassination of JFK?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just establishes where sort of the main veins of the network reside. And you could possibly work back or work forward and find out, what companies are crooked or what families are crooked, and what networks persist, and what names you're always going to want to take a second look at when they pop up in some sort of conspiratorial context or false flag or assassination. In the JFK files, I have a list of I was working on the list today, and I just want to pull up a couple. Just in the JFK files, with only a partial look, I probably have 100 textile companies listed in the JFK files. Now you can look at, which is just, you can look at other industries. If you type in textile, it's going to come up a lot. If you type in atomic energy, it comes up, but not as much. Textiles comes up prominently, and it goes, one theory I have, the textile companies, at least the smaller businesses, seem to be a front for a lot of Italian mafia and Jewish mob. What do you call it? Or these are front businesses for a lot of criminal activity. These textile companies, whether at the retail level or shipping or something like that. You see. Just one in particular. I think it's American Carpet Mills. Well, I won't get into that, but you see the names. You see textile companies pop up a lot in the JFK assassination files, more so than I would have expected. And if you look at Hillary Clinton, I mean, I right now I'm convinced her father did a favor for somebody at some point, and that's why we have her today. And her father owned a textile company in Chicago, and it's very hard to find information on this company because seems to have been scrubbed. But it was in the in the Chicago Mercantile business building, and I believe they were in that building when the uh, Chicago plot went down. In the first attempt to maybe kill JFK happened in a month before Dallas. I'm not saying she had anything to do with it, but it's an interesting. The company has an interesting name. It's Roderick Fabrics. It's very difficult to find, but again, it's just this textile type of connection. And also, he worked for Scranton Lace Company before he moved to the Chicago area, and that the Scranton, Pennsylvania area has shown up a few times.
I think, of course, of IG Farben, Farben being dye, the colors, and that, one of the big parts of that cartel. And, if the film industry, BASF and all of that, this is about dyes and chemicals, and those chemicals are often useful in weapons manufacturing too.
Right.
Uh, so that all ties together. Okay. Well, what else you want to talk about tonight, Bill?
Let's see. Um, well, I'll just mention the textile companies again. In the JFK files, you see a lot of Italian mobsters with Jewish partners in these small textile businesses, and they're moving garments and trucks and stuff all back and forth. I would say that's probably where they're sort of meeting. Um, I'm gonna see the Italian mafia is the low man on this conspiracy totem pole, sort of doing the legwork, and then the Jewish mafia is in between, and then you get to the sort of the elite levels of Anglican bankers and Jewish bankers sort of conniving and manipulating the whole thing, deciding who gets what franchise, or whether it's weapons running or racketeering or drugs. Um, you know, that's their top down approach. Uh, it's something you'll never figure it out, but it's fun to look at.
It's like a cartel,
Right.
and folks, a cartel is a group of businesses that work together to fix prices and to ensure that none of them go out of business. Similar type of thing. Was talking with David the other day about David Underdown about the uh, mega group. And what is the mega group? And it seems to be that a bunch of extremely wealthy, like multi-billionaires, that get together and chip in some money together to put together a kind of a fund to make sure that they all stay in business. Cartels, the cartels for shipping opium to China was that's how a lot of the money that was made that funds things to this day. So many of the ancient families were involved in cartels, shipping cartels, insurance cartels, just crowding everybody else out of the business to their own benefit. And that's, I see that this, when I was reading this morning from A Law Unto Itself, a story of Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm, and I feel like we hit a watershed right in the 1880s that the old values no longer worked, and the value now is in finance. It's in how it's not what people think of in terms of American capitalism, in that I'll trade you this for that. I'll give you 100 of these for 200 of those. I'll pay you then. I'll pay the freight. There's simple things that seem to be what commerce is, but that's not a tenth of the story when you realize the power of financing through banks that you may have some control over. But just talk a little bit from your point of view about what financing to me seems to be a magic trick that just takes all the fairness out of doing business. Um, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, in retrospect, it does. It's it, I would say the 1870s, 1880s. It seems like that's when sort of this European style banking came to the United States. You know, where there in Europe there were already central banks at that point. Um, you know, after Reconstruction, I'm still trying to figure it out myself. But you know, one of the themes seems to be, you know, you have this technological uh, leap forward during this period as well. You have, you know, the railroads being built and new processes for making steel to build the railroads, and electricity starts to come to fruition. You know, in a couple instances, you're seeing sort of the people's land in the form of, and I say the people's land, but you know, land that belonged to the states. Um, what seems to be a consistent theme is the state of North Carolina or the state of Virginia or New Jersey has a great idea and they're going to finance a public railroad, and then you know, with tax proceeds and fees on the works, and within a decade, it's you know, this public railroad has gone bankrupt and it's in the hands of private robber barons.
Right.
You know, so they've basically absconded with all these rights of way, probably because these robber barons and the bankers were a lot more sophisticated than your average state legislator, who was a farmer or a lawyer, or just didn't know better, or didn't think that people could be that greedy and try something so daring as to steal a railroad out from underneath the state that owned it.
But they did it again and again and again. And I talk about this on my show a lot, you know, like the Dartmouth College case, in which the Supreme Court decided that even though the Dartmouth College had been formed not by the state of New Hampshire, not by the United States of America, but by Great Britain before the Revolution, it still said that the government of New Hampshire could not alter the board of directors and could not you know, alter this, what is a public corporation, because of the private interests of those trustees pursuant to the original charter. And so that was some kind of a big issue back then when the Constitution was being drawn up. They added this thing called the Contracts Clause, and it basically inhibited state legislatures from interfering with contracts that existed before the revolution, and this, you know, this extenuation of that charter of Dartmouth College becomes a model for the extenuation of charters of corporations generally, even without any public purpose whatsoever, such as such as Coca-Cola, such as Pepsi, such as you know, all of the corporations that make so much money out of the infrastructure that, as you say, we built. You know, we built that. You know, we built those railroads. We, you know, and what business is it of these, you know, politicians to allow the Rockefellers and the Carnegies to come in and take over what really are supposed to be public assets? That's another just aspect of the crime that's been perpetrated upon the American citizens, and that's why we can't have nice things.
How do they get nice trains in Europe?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we can't have nice trains. Yeah,
we certainly don't have them in New Jersey. But
yeah, I know. I've been on them.
yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice if you could have like a 2-hour train ride from DC to New York City without any hassles? Just go. You know, why can't they do that? You know, like I got from I think it was from Rome to Venice or something in about 2 hours in Italy. I mean, they have proper high-speed trains, man.
It's wonderful to do that. I mean, and they always make the excuse in New Jersey is that, well, New Jersey doesn't have that much open space, and the rights of way cross too many road grades. Yeah, which is true. But I mean, you know, Europe has been around a lot longer. They have plenty of road grades too. I don't know why. You know, I don't know why they're able to build a 200-mile-per-hour train, but ours can only go 25 miles an hour every other day. It's you know, they're just constantly making excuses. And it's probably safer that they never have, because I'm sure it would just be dangerous if we had a 200-mile-per-hour train in New Jersey at this point. You just have to, at least if they put it over the old rights of way.
Dangerous, huh?
Yeah, I mean, just. I mean, 5 years ago, the train didn't stop in the Hoboken station. It was only going 10 miles an hour, but it didn't stop, and it just it hit the barrier and it just kept going. And I think people were killed. We can't, you don't see that happening in Europe. Just in beautiful Hoboken, New Jersey.
Funny thing, yeah. Well, they get to have trains, but they can't afford to drive. So.
Right.
At least
Yeah.
that's the thing about America is, we our politicians know that we've got to have affordable gasoline prices, and
Right.
everything else is secondary, including, going to war, everything.
Because everybody wants a piece of the action to it here in the United States. If a Boston to DC train, the corridors are all there, the tracks are all there. That's the ideal place where you'd want a high-speed rail network. You're going from Boston to New York to Philadelphia to Baltimore to DC. That's ideal. But somebody from Kansas is going to complain that, why am I paying for this system from Massachusetts to Maryland that we'll never use? We want one that goes from Topeka to Helena, Montana. Well, nobody wants to go there. Nobody's going between Helena, Montana and Topeka, Kansas. But they'll insist on having that rail line in there so they can tell their constituents, look what we got.
Yeah. Makes a beautiful advertisement. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what it does.
That's so typical, really, when you think about it. How business is often they're providing a service, but it's not the service that they're telling you it is. It's
no. Yeah, I don't know what happened. There was a lot of train network. We have tracks all over the place where I live from lines that don't exist anymore, so they can really go anywhere. And the rights of way are still valid in a lot of these towns. But we really only have one where I live that actually works, and not well. But
let me check into the chat here and see what you guys are talking about while we're talking. Miss Hunt says they have this op zipped up like a body bag. Oops, that one just scooted away. With an industrial metal half-inch zipper. Okay. George Carlin, Jersey is where you have to pay a toll to back out of your driveway. Isn't that true? Yeah, I remember so many times we would drive up to Connecticut and every stop, throw a quarter in the.
That was a Bill Cosby joke. He had an uncle in New Jersey who just put a basket in front of his house and people just threw money at it as they drove by.
Isn't Frank Sinatra from Hoboken?
Yes, he is from Hoboken.
Okay, all right. But David says that Dean Martin is from Steubenville, Ohio.
Nice.
Well, that's kind of tragic. I mean, Steubenville doesn't sound Italian at all. And Dean Martin, I mean, he wanted to be, Dean Martin, he's such a tragic figure, really. Pretty good singer, but I don't think he worked hard enough at singing. I think he was just more of a drinker.
Yeah.
That's just me. Dino Martino. John, do you remember Housatonic Mills in Connecticut? I kind of do, but I'm not sure what it was. It a mall? Maybe it was a mall. No, I guess I don't. My great grandfather worked in a mill in Willimantic, Connecticut. Willimantic, Connecticut, down in the southeastern corner of Connecticut towards Rhode Island, is known as the Thread City. And it's, obviously had a lot of thread mills. my great-great-grandfather started a bar and bowling alley business there, and that's where the family got its roots. Then they moved to Hartford and did the same thing in Hartford while he was working at Colt Arms Factory, the famous old firearms factory in Hartford. Well, that's about all I've got tonight. Bill, anything else on your mind before we wrap it up?
Um, Hopefully, I can get a couple more essays out. I mean, some other things that are interesting. Um, I'm working on the. I like to. I have a Norfolk to Dallas connection. Uh, to Norfolk, Virginia to Dallas JFK assassination connection, which keeps yielding interesting names.
Mm-hmm.
There's the I've written about um, uh, Jerry Hoy, Malcolm Jerry Hoy, who was a witness to the JFK assassination. The FBI caught up with him in 6 months after the assassination. It turns out that he got his he got a reference from the great uncle or the uncle of New Jersey First Lady Tammy Snyder Murphy. Now that's one connection. There's also he worked in a General Motors plant in Arlington, Texas. At the same time that he was working there was a gentleman named Frank Guzman, but he goes by or Frank Vilmia Guzman, or just Frank Villamina. He goes by several different names. This Cuban, he was a member of the SNPE, a Cuban revolutionary group. At the same time, Hoy was there, and he had been arrested for running guns with Frank Sturgis at one point in 1959. Frank Sturgis is also from Norfolk. Um, you also have Wallace Groves, who I don't connect to anybody else yet, but Wallace Groves is from Norfolk. He's in charge of he started Resorts International in the Bahamas,
Mm-hmm.
which was a big front. I think I mentioned last time I was on the show Julius Salisbury, a Chicago mobster, also from Norfolk. Anyway, the point being that I'm finding a lot of Norfolk connections to the JFK assassination and various criminal networks uh, around the country. Um, and what might be interesting and needs more work is Norfolk is also where Langley Air Force Base is, which is the original home of NASA, the original NASA headquarters. Its predecessor was, I forget the name of the predecessor, but they've been there since the 1920s. But all the high-tech stuff came through through Langley Air Force Base, like proximity fuses in World War II, and then jet engine testing and it's basically an R&D lab, which it looks like the powers that be were stealing the secrets from and selling them around the world during the 1950s and 60s.
Out of Langley and Norfolk.
Right, right.
Yeah, which I think is actually in Hampton Roads, if I remember, because we used to drive up Mercury Boulevard, and Mercury Boulevard named after the Mercury astronaut program, and it was a big deal. The astronaut NASA thing was a big deal down there in the Tidewater area, Norfolk, Hampton Roads, and Newport News. Yeah, that's where I went to college at William and Mary, and so that's Langley Field is down there. Langley, the CIA headquarters, is up in Virginia near Washington D.C., and sometimes that confuses folks.
Right. There's Hampton College or Hampton University. It's Hampton University now. Hampton College was there as well. That has some interesting background. It was started by a Northern General Armstrong, and we find him connected to through his daughter, connected to the Amories and the Auchinclosses as well. The general's granddaughter married Robert Amory Jr., who was the deputy director of intelligence during the Kennedy first couple of years of the Kennedy administration, and he's never mentioned on the list of people that Kennedy fired, but it looks like he was fired to me. That was Dulles, Bissell, General Cabell, and then the fourth guy who was at the same level as Bissell. He left 3 weeks after Bissell did in 1961. So I don't know why he's always left off the list of Kennedy apparatchiks who were let go. But that might be a tell in itself that nobody wants you to know who Robert Amory Jr. is, Deputy Director of Intelligence.
Well, tell us more about that. I know you have referred to him as the fourth guy that got fired by Kennedy, and I had no idea myself. So you're right. People don't know about this Robert Amory, and this connection to Norfolk, and trading secrets out of there is intriguing, of course. Ports, ports are places where things leak out for sure. All right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Robert Amory, for all the UFO aficionados out there, Robert Amory Jr. shows up in the UFO files a lot. He's supposedly the keeper of the UFO secrets. Whether he had any secrets to keep or not, he's definitely an interesting fellow who nobody seems to have written much about at all.
Well, who's the other guy on that suddenly became a UFO expert? Was one of the right-wing people. Gosh, I read so much now that something I read 2 weeks ago and I can't remember what it was.
Mellon?
Corso, Philip Corso.
Oh, Corso, yeah.
Yeah, Philip Corso. He's a really important guy, and I think they had him write this book about UFOs as a kind of a throw. That's my suspicion, but there's another guy that they say this is the UFO guy.
Right.
These guys are doing a lot of other stuff that they don't want us to look at. So,
Right. We can't ask any questions about UFOs.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still thinking that they're right, that they could fly. You get the one magnet spinning this way and the other magnet spinning that way, and at some point you get plasma, and the plasma is going to come on. All we got to do is just get the proper materials, and we could build this thing,
Right.
Bill. We can fly it wherever we want to, ride on the electromagnetic waves.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot for being with us tonight. Thank you again, Bill Taylor, William Kittle, 15, and at D-State Research. Is that the latest name? Is that the correct name?
Yeah, you can go, if you just go d-statenews.com, that'll take you everywhere. It'll take you to the original site, D-State Analytics. It'll take you to the news site. It'll take you everywhere.
All right. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to your next essays.
Okay. Very good. Bye.
Good night.